In a forgotten library cloaked in dust and candlelight, a lone scholar bends over a tome bound in crumbling leather. The ink bleeds with age, the words half-erased, as if the parchment itself resists what's written upon it. This is no ordinary scripture, it is the Book of Enoch, a text banished from the Holy Canon, whispered to contain the true names of angels and the crimes of heaven itself. For centuries, its pages have lingered at the edges of faith, condemned by priests, pursued by kings, and hidden by those who dared to read what others feared to even name. What secret could be so dangerous that it threatened the very foundation of divine order? Why did men of God bury it beneath silence, rather than burn it in plain sight? The Book of Enoch stands as a wound in Historia, forbidden bridge between the mortal and the divine. A relic of a time when knowledge itself was a sin. Its survival defies erasure. Its words still whisper through the centuries. And so begins the question that echoes through every age. What happens when humanity dares to read what heaven forbids? Long before the floodwaters rose, before empires carved their names into stone, there lived a man named Enoch, a figure who walked between the realms of flesh and eternity. His story is older than nations, older even than scripture, whispered across civilizations like a sacred rumor. In the book of Genesis, his life is described in only a few lines. Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. But behind that brief verse lies one of the most haunting mysteries in human history, a tale of divine communion, celestial rebellion, and a truth too vast for the mortal mind. They say Enoch was not merely a prophet, but a bridge between man and the divine. Unlike the others who spoke to God from below, Enoch was drawn into the heavens while still alive, to witness the machinery of creation itself. In visions that shattered the limits of human sight, he beheld the architecture of the cosmos, the stars arranged like sentinels, the pillars of the world vibrating with hidden laws, the thrones of angels circling a light too pure for speech. Enoch became the first mortal to step beyond the veil and return, with the forbidden knowledge of what lay beyond the stars. But the heavens he saw were not, as the priests would later teach. There was order, yes, but also disobedience, radiant beings who defied their maker. These were the Watchers, sent to observe humanity, to guide without interfering. Yet when they looked upon the daughters of men, desire took root in their immortal hearts. They descended from the heights of heaven, clothed in radiance, and lay with mortal women. From this union were born the Nephilim, giants of impossible stature, beings of both flesh and fire, who devoured the earth and warred against the will of heaven. The world trembled beneath their weight. The rivers ran red. The cries of the dying reached even the halls of God. And so the Creator, wrathful at this corruption, turned his gaze upon the earth once more. But before the judgment, before the cleansing flood, one man was chosen to bear witness to the divine reckoning. Enoch. In the hidden writings that bear his name, Enoch is taken once more by the archangel Raphael, and Uriel, and shown the fate of the fallen. He is led through the 7 heavens, each one stranger and more terrible than the last. He sees the prisons of the Watchers, bound in darkness beneath mountains of flame, awaiting the final day when even angels will be judged. He sees the rivers of fire that flow beneath creation, the vaults where souls are measured, and the book of life where every deed is inscribed. Enoch is made to understand not only the justice of God, but the consequences of divine rebellion. Yet these revelations are not warnings, they are temptations. To know the secrets of heaven is to stand where no mortal should, to risk the blinding light of truth. The Watchers taught humankind the arts that heaven had forbidden, the making of weapons, the shaping of metals, the mixing of potions, the reading of stars, knowledge that gave birth to kingdoms and to sin. Enoch records it all, each law, each symbol, each hidden name of the angels who defied the throne. His writings, if true, contained the blueprint of creation itself. It is said that as Enoch's wisdom deepened, his form began to change. His eyes burned like the stars he studied. His words carried echoes of thunder, and when his transformation was complete, he was no longer counted among men. God took him not in death, but in metamorphosis. Some traditions say he was remade as the archangel Metatron, the celestial scribe who sits beside the divine throne, measuring time and destiny. Others claim he was dissolved into pure light, his body scattered across the constellations, his voice forever whispering through the firmament. The story of Enoch was more than myth, it was a challenge to the order of heaven and earth. For if a man could walk with God and live, then the boundary between divine and mortal was not immutable. If angels could fall for love of flesh, then purity itself was fragile. The Book of Enoch told of a cosmos not ruled by perfect harmony but by conflict, curiosity, and rebellion, the same elements that drive the human soul, and so, the legend was silenced. The priests declared it apocryphal. The councils struck it from the sacred record. They could not allow such a vision to stand, a vision in which knowledge was both salvation and sin, where the divine was not unreachable but perilously close. To preserve heaven's distance, they buried Enoch's revelations beneath centuries of dust. Yet the myth endured, carried in whispers across deserts and monasteries, etched into forgotten scrolls, translated in secret by mystics and dreamers. To some, Enoch became a symbol of forbidden enlightenment, a man who dared to see the face of the divine without mediation. To others, he was a warning of hubris, proof that even holiness can burn those who reach too high. But no matter how the story was told, one truth remained constant. Enoch's journey was not meant for the faithful. It was meant for the fearless, for those willing to open the book and confront the terrifying symmetry of heaven and hell. For what he saw was not simply creation, but reflection. The same light that gave birth to angels also cast their shadows. The same divine order that made the world also allowed it to break. In revealing the secrets of heaven, Enoch revealed the paradox of existence itself, that knowledge is both the bridge and the abyss, and that is why his book was feared, not forgotten. It did not simply describe the world, it dismantled it. It tore the veil between the seen and unseen, showing humanity that paradise and damnation were not places beyond the sky, but forces within every human soul. As the centuries turned, the name of Enoch faded from the pulpits, but not from memory. His legend survived in silence in the minds of those who sensed there was more to the world than what was preached, more to creation than what was written. They would search for his book, his words, his truth, and in that search, they would awaken something ancient. For when man reaches into the heavens for truth, the heavens do not always remain silent, and in the echo of that silence, the story of Enoch still speaks. When myth dissolves into history, the story of Enoch becomes not just legend, but evidence. The Book of Enoch, once revered by early mystics and prophets, slowly vanished from the sacred libraries of the West. Yet, its disappearance was not an accident of time. It was an act of deliberate erasure, a text too bold, too blasphemous, and too revelatory to survive the scrutiny of empires built on divine authority. The roots of the book stretched deep into ancient Judaic mysticism. Long before the rise of formalized Christianity, there were sects within Israel who read Enoch's writings as divine revelation, a bridge between prophecy and cosmology. They believed it unveiled the architecture of heaven and the hierarchy of angels, a celestial order that mirrored the earthly. In these early centuries, Enoch was not a heretic. He was a visionary, a prophet whose writings shaped the apocalyptic imagination that would later define the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Book of Daniel, and even the Revelation of John. But the age of revelation gave way to the age of orthodoxy. As the early church began to consolidate its authority, every text that blurred the line between heaven and earth was questioned. The councils of the 4th century Nicaea, Laodicea, and later Carthage sought not merely to preserve divine truth, but to control it. Scripture was to be curated, purified, and made safe for belief. The Book of Enoch, with its tales of angelic rebellion and secret knowledge, did not fit that vision. It spoke of angels who sinned, of divine beings who defied heaven, of forbidden arts passed to mankind. To the Church Fathers, these were not teachings, they were dangers. By the time the biblical canon was sealed, Enoch's book was gone. It was declared apocryphal, then heretical, and finally forgotten, or so it seemed. While Europe buried it, the East remembered. In the highlands of Ethiopia, where the light of ancient Christianity burned differently, the Ethiopic Church preserved a complete version of the Book of Enoch within its sacred canon. There, it was known not as heresy, but as history, one of the oldest testimonies of divine judgment before the flood. For centuries, while Latin priests denounced it and Greek scholars dismissed it, Ethiopian monks copied it by hand, line by line, in the ancient language of Jesus. Their monasteries became silent vaults of resistance, protecting the words the rest of the world had chosen to forget. It wasn't until the 18th century that the Western world glimpsed the forbidden book again. In 1773, a Scottish explorer named James Bruce returned from Abyssinia, carrying 3 precious manuscripts each, a copy of the Ethiopic Book of Enoch, 2 scholars of the Enlightenment. This was no mere curiosity. It was a resurrection. The book they believed lost since the early centuries of the church now existed in their hands. Yet even then, few dared to embrace it openly. Translating the Book of Enoch meant confronting the uncomfortable truth that Christianity had edited its own origins. Bruce's manuscripts circulated quietly among intellectual circles in Europe. In 1821, Richard Lawrence, an Oxford scholar and theologian, published the first English translation. His work was controversial, not for its language, but for its implications. The Book of Enoch described a universe where divine order was fragile, where knowledge could corrupt, and where angels were not symbols of purity, but agents of tragedy. It told of a flood, not merely as punishment for sin, but as an act of cosmic cleansing away to reset creation after heaven itself had faltered. Such theology clashed with centuries of dogma. The Church's reaction was silence, but it was the silence of unease. To admit the Book of Enoch's authenticity was to acknowledge that the Old Testament and the New were not isolated revelations, but fragments of a larger, stranger truth. Even so, traces of Enoch's influence lingered in familiar texts. The Epistle of Jude in the New Testament quotes Enoch directly. "Behold, the Lord comes with 10,000s of his holy ones to execute judgment upon all." That a banned book was cited by an apostle was not a coincidence. It was a confession, hidden in plain sight. Centuries later, archaeology unearthed more than rumor. In 1947, the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in the caves of Qumran, ancient manuscripts, sealed away by a sect of Jewish mystics. Perhaps among them were multiple fragments of the Book of Enoch, written in Aramaic and Hebrew, confirming what had long been suspected. The text was older than Christianity itself. It was not an invention of heretics, but a cornerstone of early apocalyptic belief. These discoveries ignited a quiet rebellion within scholarship. Historians, linguists, and theologians began to ask the question the Church had avoided for centuries: what else had been left out? If Enoch's visions were once considered divine, what compelled the councils to erase them? The answers point not to blasphemy, but to fear. Enoch's book dismantled the clean hierarchy between God, angels, and man. It implied that divine beings could fall, that heaven itself was not beyond corruption. Such ideas threatened to blur the moral lines that held the cosmos and the Church together. In Enoch's world, salvation was not given through obedience, but through knowledge, through awakening, and that, above all, was intolerable. Yet across centuries of suppression, the Book of Enoch endured like an ember beneath ash. Translations continued in secret. Scholars risked censure to study it. Priests whispered its passages behind closed doors. Its survival is a defiance of authority itself, a book that refused to die, outliving the very powers that sought to silence it. The story of Enoch's text is, at its core, the story of every forbidden book. It is the struggle between revelation and control, between the pursuit of truth and the preservation of order. To read it was to rebel, to risk one's faith for the possibility of understanding. And so, history became its own kind of scripture, a record, not just of what was remembered, but of what was removed. For in every age, there are truths too vast for power to permit, and too sacred for silence to contain. The Book of Enoch stands among them, a relic of light cast into shadow, waiting for the day humanity dares to read again what heaven once forbade. Every forbidden text hides a wound, a place where history was cut open and knowledge was bled out. The Book of Enoch is no exception. For centuries, whispers have circulated among scholars, mystics, and priests alike that the versions surviving today are incomplete, mere shadows of a far greater revelation. Somewhere in time, entire passages vanished, excised not by decay or accident, but by design. These are the banned pages of Enoch, the missing words said to reveal the deepest architecture of the cosmos, and the secrets that even heaven sought to erase. What could those pages have contained? The question has haunted historians since the first fragments were unearthed from Ethiopian monasteries and the caves of Qumran. What we possess, those scattered books known as the Book of Watchers, the Book of Parables, the Astronomical Book, and the Epistle of Enoch, read like the remnants of something larger, stitched together from the ruins of Revelation. But the omissions are palpable. Entire transitions end abruptly, as though a hand tore out the continuation. References appear to other visions or revelations that no longer exist. Some scholars believe the lost sections dealt with the second rebellion of the Watchers, the moment, not merely of their descent, but of their punishment. These were the pages, they argue, that described in terrible detail the final judgment of the fallen angels. Enoch, guided by the archangels, was said to have witnessed their torment firsthand. The watchers bound in chains of fire, suspended in darkness beneath mountains of glass. The text alludes to this, and I saw there the prisons of the stars, but never completes the vision. What was too terrifying to preserve? Others suggest the missing material revealed the blueprint of creation itself. The surviving portions of the astronomical book describe complex cycles of the sun and moon, a divine clockwork of seasons and stars. But mystics insist these passages were symbolic, concealing deeper truths about energy, frequency, and form. The banned pages, they say, described the mechanics of divine power laws of transformation that mirrored what alchemists would later call, as above, so below. In their eyes, Enoch was not merely a prophet, but a scientist of Heaven, keeper of spiritual physics that could bridge the divine and material worlds. If this sounds like blasphemy, that was precisely the point. For the Church, such revelations blurred the sacred hierarchy separating creator from creation. If men could understand the laws of heaven, they might one day wield them. This was knowledge that unmade obedience, that replaced prayer with practice. And so, the pages vanished. Occultists throughout history have pursued these absences, like treasure maps drawn in negative space. Renaissance Magi, Rosicrucians, and later Theosophists all claimed that Enoch's missing chapters contained instructions for communion with celestial intelligences. They called it Enochian Magica, system of language and symbols said to open gates between worlds. John Dee, the 16th century advisor to Queen Elizabeth I, claimed to have received angelic communications derived from Enoch's lost words. Whether through mystic trance or dangerous imagination, he believed he was resurrecting a fragment of that ancient script. 2D, Enoch's knowledge was not lost, it was hidden in plain sight, encrypted in the geometry of the universe itself. Yet not all interpretations are mystical. Theologians, less given to enchantment but equally wary of implication, suspect that the missing passages spoke of something far darker, the origin of evil itself. In Enoch's cosmology, evil is not born from man, but from celestial disobedience from beings who possessed perfect knowledge yet chose corruption. Such a view undermines the tidy symmetry of later theology. It means that sin is not a human defect but a cosmic inheritance, written into the universe from the beginning. To preserve divine perfection, the Church needed to excise this idea. The fault must belong to man, not to heaven. The fragments that remain tease at this forbidden doctrine. Enoch writes of angels who taught men charms and enchantments, and the cutting of roots, and made them acquainted with plants. Another passage names Azazel, a fallen being who taught men to make swords, and knives, and shields, and women the beautifying of the eyelids, and all kinds of costly stones. These acts of teaching knowledge of beauty, weaponry, and nature become the genesis of corruption. In Enoch's world, knowledge itself is dangerous. To learn is to risk falling. The missing pages, many believe, carried this idea to its conclusion, that even the divine was not immune to its own temptation. Some scholars speculate that these lost passages contained Enoch's final revelation, a dialogue with the Creator, in which he glimpsed the destiny of human consciousness. One theory, born from comparative studies of early mysticism, suggests that Enoch's ultimate vision was not destruction, but transformation, that the fall of the Watchers and the birth of humankind were parts of the same cosmic cycle, the eternal exchange between knowledge and innocence. Humanity's purpose, he might have written, was to reconcile the two, to become both mortal and divine, creators within creation. If that was the truth Enoch saw, then it was truly forbidden. A religion built on hierarchy cannot survive the revelation that divinity resides within its followers. To suppress such an idea would not merely protect, dogma, it would preserve control. And so, perhaps, those who held power made the simplest decision possible. They made Enoch's truth disappear. What remains is haunting precisely because it is incomplete. The Book of Enoch feels like a dream half remembered, its absences as evocative as its words. We know what came before and what follows, but never what lies between. It is the silence between verses, the place where knowledge was taken from us, that stirs the imagination. To read Enoch today is to confront that silence directly. We sense it in every gap, every lost line of presence just beyond comprehension. Was it a map to the heavens, a prophecy of humanity's evolution, a confession from angels who failed their purpose? The truth remains buried, perhaps intentionally so, but one cannot silence revelation forever. Each rediscovered fragment, each whispered theory, brings us closer to the edges of what Enoch saw. And as history has shown, mankind cannot resist forbidden knowledge for long. We reach, we study, we remember, and in doing so, we reopen the very pages that once drove angels to fall. Perhaps the missing words were never meant to be found. Perhaps they were a mirror, showing us the same hunger that consumed the Watchers, the desire to know what should remain beyond reach. But even now, in the dim light of surviving scripture, the echo of those pages persists. They remind us that truth is not always a gift. Sometimes, it is the fire we were never meant to touch. When the Book of Enoch slipped into darkness, its words did not vanish, they transformed. What the Church called heresy, others called revelation. Across centuries, fragments of its teachings resurfaced in secret orders, whispered incantations, and cryptic manuscripts. The Watchers, once angels cast from heaven, became symbols of enlightenment, bringers of forbidden knowledge, whose fall was not damnation but sacrifice. Their story was no longer a warning, it was a ritual blueprint to the mystics of late antiquity. Enoch was not a prophet of doom, but the first initiates the mortal who ascended to divine understanding and returned, bearing secrets too dangerous for the unprepared. His visions, they believed, were not allegory but instruction, a map for the soul's transformation. Gnostic sects, such as the Sethians and the Aphids, reinterpreted the tale of the Watchers as a cosmic rebellion of spirit against tyranny. The serpent in Eden, they said, was no deceiver but a liberator, echoing the angels who shared knowledge with humankind. Through secret rites of illumination, they sought to recover that lost wisdom to become as Enoch had. Like the angels, these early mystics practiced rituals of inner ascent, often under the shadow of persecution. They meditated upon the names of divine beings, tracing their origins through sacred alphabets. Some writings from the Nag Hammadi codices describe initiates attempting to pass through heavenly gates, each guarded by an angel whose name must be spoken correctly to proceed. This spiritual ascent mirrored Enoch's own journey through the seven heavens, a pilgrimage from flesh to fire. The difference was that these seekers did not wait to be chosen. They sought to force their way into heaven. By the Middle Ages, such practices had splintered and evolved. The legend of the Watchers migrated into alchemical symbolism, their descent reimagined as the transformation of pure spirit into base matter, and their redemption as the purification of that matter back into light. In the dim laboratories of European alchemists, Enoch's cosmology lived on in new forms: crucibles, sigils, and coded texts. The alchemist's furnace became the fallen angel's panensa, microcosm of divine rebellion redeemed through fire. Alchemy's secret motto, solvi te coagulatu, dissolve and to rebendicode the fate of the Watchers, beings who were broken apart and remade. Many alchemical diagrams show winged figures bound in chains of flame, their ascent mirrored by the rise of vapors within the vessel. To the uninitiated, it was chemistry. To the adept, it was the reenactment of the cosmic fall, a ritual designed to reclaim the light imprisoned in matter. Hidden within Hermeticism, the esoteric philosophy attributed to Hermes Trismegistus lie even deeper parallels. The Hermetic texts, much like Enoch's writings, describe a divine descent, the journey of spiritual intelligences into the material world. Humanity, in this view, is a spark of divinity trapped in flesh, destined to awaken through gnosis. The Watchers' sin, then, was not their love of humankind, but their attempt to accelerate that awakening. They gave humanity tools, astronomy, metallurgy, medicine that mirrored the creative acts of the divine. In Hermetic tradition, these are the arts of ascent pathways through which man might reclaim his divine origin. The Kabbalists of medieval Spain and the Rhineland took this concept further. Through the study of the Sefer Yetzirah and later the Zohar, they explored creation as a series of emanations, 10 divine spheres, or Sephiro, through which the infinite descended into form. The angels who fell, they believed, were fragments of these emanations, vessels that shattered under the weight of divine light. To study their names, to trace their hierarchies, was to understand the very structure of the cosmos. But such study carried risk. One Kabbalistic warning cautions, "He who gazes into the chariot without purity shall be consumed." Enoch himself had seen that chariot. The Merkabah survived. The Kabbalists sought to do the same. Their prayers and meditations designed to ascend through the divine spheres, as Enoch once did. During the Renaissance, The legend of the Watchers ignited anew in the minds of scholars who straddled the line between science and sorcery. Men like Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, Cornelius Agrippa, and John Dee believed that Enoch's book held the key to universal knowledge, the Prisca or ancient theology, that unified all truth. They claimed that the forbidden teachings of Enoch were not lost, but encoded within sacred geometry, angelic languages, and mathematical harmonies. In their laboratories and studies, they sought contact with celestial beings not to worship, but to learn. John Dee, working with the medium Edward Kelly, claimed to have received messages from angels in a mysterious script he called Enochian. The symbols, written in precise grids and patterns, were said to open ethers or dimensions of divine consciousness. 2D, this was not witchcraft, but revelation and extension of Enoch's ancient dialogues with heaven. Yet the church saw only heresy. Dee's correspondences were seized, his reputation tarnished. Still, the language survived, resurfacing centuries later in occult orders such as the Golden Dawn and Aleister Crowley's each claimed to continue the work of the first scribe of heaven, decoding the lost grammar of creation. But beneath these diverse practices, the Gnostic ascent, the alchemical transmutation, the Kabbalistic meditation, the Hermetic invocation runs a single current: defiance. The rituals inspired by Enoch's forbidden pages were acts of rebellion against the imposed boundaries between man and the divine. They sought not faith through obedience, but enlightenment through transgression. To walk with God, as Enoch did, one must first risk being cast out. The idea that these rituals were derived from Enoch's lost writings persists in modern esotericism. Some occultists interpret the banned pages as metaphysical instructions, manuals for unlocking the latent divinity within human consciousness. They argue that the Watchers were not demons but initiators, punished for giving humanity the power to evolve beyond servitude. In this view, every ritual from the alchemist's experiment to the mystic's meditations an echo of that original act of defiance. The danger, of course, is the same now as it was then. To approach the forbidden is to risk corruption as well as illumination. For every seeker who ascends, another falls. The rituals of the Watchers promise transcendence, but they demand surrender, the loss of self, of certainty, of safety. Perhaps that is why the Book of Enoch was buried, not to conceal evil, but to protect the unready from the truth that knowledge has no master. In the end, the rituals were never about summoning angels or commanding spirits. They were about transformation, about touching the fire that burns between heaven and earth and daring to survive it. And so, in the echo of Enoch's vanished pages, the forbidden practices endure, half prayer, half rebellion, whispering that divinity was never meant to be obeyed, it was meant to be understood. The story of the Book of Enoch is not only a tale of angels and lost pages, it is the history of a war waged in silence. A war not fought with swords, but with interpretation. From the earliest centuries of the Church, one question burned through councils, cathedrals, and cloisters alike: what happens when revelation threatens authority? The answer, as always, was control. The Book of Enoch was a paradox to early theologians. It spoke of divine beings who sinned, of celestial hierarchies breaking apart, of angels who mingled with human flesh and birthed giants. In Enoch's world, heaven was not a realm of perfect obedience, it was a kingdom capable of fracture. To the early fathers of the Church, such an idea was dangerous. It inverted the cosmic order on which their theology rested. If even angels could fall, what security remained for man? Tertullian, writing in the 2nd century, was one of the few to defend the book. In his treatise on the apparel of women, he cited Enoch as sacred history, using it to explain how sin entered the world through the forbidden teachings of the Watchers' cosmetics, weaponry, adornment, and pride. To him, Enoch's revelations were not myth but warning. Yet even Tertullian's defense was tinged with unease. He admitted that the Jews rejected Enoch and that Christians were cautious, but he urged his readers to see truth in its pages nonetheless. His endorsement would not save the text, rather, it would highlight its danger. By the time of Augustine, that danger had become doctrine. In the City of God, Augustine wrestled with the same question that haunted theologians for centuries: who were the sons of God who lay with the daughters of men in Genesis 6? Were they angels, as Enoch claimed, or merely the descendants of Seth, the righteous bloodline of Adam? Augustine chose the latter, not because it fit the scripture better, but because it was safer. To admit the angelic rebellion was to admit that divine creation could err and that heaven was not. incorruptible. This theological pivot marked the beginning of what can only be described as a censorship of cosmology. Heaven was purified by decree. Angels were stripped of their complexity, their moral agency reduced to either perfect obedience or total damnation. The gray between the tragic beauty of beings torn between divine and mortal was erased. The church needed simplicity, not ambiguity. It needed order, not myth. Through the Middle Ages, Enoch's writings became both fascination and threat. Monks and scholars copied fragments in secret, their margins filled with warnings. Cave lector reader, beware. To study Enoch was to walk the thin line between scholarship and heresy. In monasteries across Europe, theological debates whispered of the Watcher's true nature. Were they metaphors for fallen priests, political rebels, or something literal beings whose memory had been weaponized into symbol? The answers varied, but the fear was constant. By the Renaissance, the war over heaven had shifted to new ground: academia. As the church's grip loosened, scholars began to re-examine what had been buried. Humanists like Giovanni Pico della Mirandola and later mystic philosophers such as Paracelsus and Jacob Boehme reinterpreted Enoch's visions not as divine blasphemy but as coded metaphysics. They saw in his cosmology an allegory for the human soul, a mirror of the divine fall into matter and the long, painful climb back to light. Where theologians saw corruption, the esoteric thinkers saw awakening. Yet this reawakening did not come without cost. The church, wary of the intellectual contagion spreading through Europe, doubled down on orthodoxy. The Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the list of forbidden books, grew longer with each century. To question heaven was to question the hierarchy on earth. The Vatican's power depended on the same architecture that Enoch's story threatened, a flawless divine chain of command. If that chain could break above, it could break below. Even modern scholars have not escaped this tension. In the 19th and 20th centuries, the rediscovery of the Book of Enoch through the Dead Sea Scrolls reignited debates across theology and anthropology alike. Some academics, such as R.H. Charles and later George Nicholsberg, treated Enoch's visions as a product of Second Temple mysticism, symbolic protest against corrupt priesthoods and empires. In their view, the fallen angels were metaphors for earthly powers, kings who claimed divine right and fell through hubris. Others, particularly within esoteric and comparative religious studies, rejected that reduction. They argued that Enoch's visions bore the unmistakable structure of genuine, mystical experience: ascent through celestial realms, encounters with luminous beings, revelations of hidden laws. The academic divide reflects the same battle fought for 2,000 years: belief versus control, revelation versus explanation. To the theologian, Enoch's book is dangerous because it democratizes the divine. It suggests that ordinary humans, through vision and understanding, can pierce the veil without institutional permission. To the scholar, that danger is psychological. An unguarded mind approaching infinity risks delusion. To the mystic, it is liberation. This triad, church, academia, and mysticism, forms the modern battlefield of heaven. Each interprets Enoch through its own lens. Each seeks to contain him in categories: heresy, history, hallucination. But the text itself resists containment. It is not content to be explained. It demands to be experienced. And that is precisely why it survives. Today, debates about the Book of Enoch extend beyond theology. Psychologists and philosophers now interpret its visions as archetypes, expressions of humanity's ancient trauma with authority. The Watcher's fall becomes the symbol of forbidden curiosity, the eternal struggle between obedience and awakening. The Church once called it sin. Jung would call it individuation, the descent into shadow to reclaim lost fragments of the self. In this way, the war over heaven was never really about angels. It was about the human mind. And yet, the institutions of faith have not abandoned the battlefield. Even now, official theology treats Enoch's revelations with caution, labeling them myth or metaphor. But beneath the surface, interest grows. Priests study the Apocrypha in secret. Seminaries host quiet seminars on the Watchers and their echoes in modern angelology. The war may be quieter now, but it is far from over. Because in the end, Enoch's story is not about rebellion, it is about knowledge. The Church sought to guard heaven from human hands. Scholars sought to dissect it. Mystics sought to climb it. But Enoch himself did none of these. He simply walked with God, neither questioning nor obeying, only seeking. And in that act, He became the heretic every empire fears, the one who listens directly. The war over heaven continues, because it was never fought above it, was always within us. In every age, the question returns, whispered beneath doctrine and doubt alike, is faith the courage to obey or the courage to know? The Book of Enoch may have been erased from the sacred canon, but its shadow never left the human imagination. Like a forbidden melody hummed through centuries, its verses resurfaced in art, legend, and rumor distorted, reframed, but unmistakable. Every myth of fallen angels, every story of divine rebellion, every painting that dared to depict heaven in chaos bears Enoch's quiet signature. For though the church silenced his name, his cosmology became the hidden grammar of Western myth. In medieval cathedrals, where stone angels stretched their wings toward heaven, echoes of Enoch's tale appeared in glass and pigment. The Gothic masters may never have cited him directly, but their art breathed his vision. Celestial beings bound in grief, giants lying vanquished beneath mountains, a sky fractured between light and shadow. In the margins of illuminated manuscripts, those strange, haunting corners where scribes indulged their secret imaginations, tiny figures fall from golden clouds, wings ablaze. They are the Watchers, recast not as demons, but as tragic symbols of knowledge lost. The theme of divine transgression found its way into the great works of medieval mysticism as well. In Dante's Inferno, the rebellion of Lucifer carries unmistakable Enochian echoes, the brightest of God's host, cast down by pride, imprisoned in ice. In Milton's Paradise Lost, the Watcher's legacy expands into epic poetry, angelic insurgents who fall not for evil's sake, but for freedom's. Milton's Satan, in his eloquence and defiance, is not far removed from the fallen angels of Enoch, who defied heaven to bring light to humankind. Even the giants of classical mythology, titans bound beneath mountains, Prometheus chained for bringing fire, reflect the same archetype. It is the eternal image of the bringer of knowledge, punished for his generosity. But Enoch's influence was not confined to poetry or art, it bled into the veins of magic itself. By the late Middle Ages, occult grimoires began to surface across Europe, their inked pages claiming descent from ancient wisdom. Among them were texts like the Book of Abramelin, the Lemurketon, and later the Ars Goetia works, obsessed with hierarchies of spirits and celestial lore. Many of these grimoires traced their language, symbols, and angelic names to what scholars now recognize as Enochian tradition. John Dee's angelic alphabet, which he believed to be the very tongue of heaven, was not an invention, it was a reconstruction of what had long been whispered about the lost language of Enoch. In these texts, the fallen angels ceased to be purely evil, they became teachers. To summon them was not to worship, but to learn to risk madness for knowledge. The grimoires taught that the divine and the damned were often one and the same, their difference lying only in obedience. This was Enoch's theology rewritten in secret ink, carried forward by magicians who dared to reopen the doors that orthodoxy had sealed. As Europe entered the Enlightenment, the myth retreated from the pulpit but flourished in art. Painters like William Blake resurrected Enoch's vision in color and fire. Blake's The Ancient of Days, depicting God bending over creation with compass in hand, draws directly from apocryphal imagery, divinity as architect, not ruler. His angels were not abstract symbols but living contradictions, radiant, suffering, endlessly yearning. In Blake's universe, creation was rebellion and rebellion was divine. The Watchers had found their prophet anew. In the 19th century, as archaeology unearthed ancient tablets and lost scriptures, the Book of Enoch stepped back into daylight. Translations spread among theologians, poets, and theosophical societies embraced it as evidence of a primordial wisdom predating all religion. Helena Blavatsky, founder of Theosophy, wrote that Enoch represented the link between divine and human intelligence. For her, he was the first initiate, the prototype of secret knowledge transmitted through mystery schools. In Blavatsky's cosmology, the Watchers became not fallen angels, but sons of light, guardians of a spiritual evolution the Church had long denied. Even modern fiction has never escaped Enoch's reach. From H.P. Lovecraft's Old Ones, vast cosmic intelligences banished from the heavens, to modern films depicting ancient alien architects or divine insurgents, the same themes resurface: forbidden knowledge, celestial rebellion, the cost of illumination. Hollywood's obsessions: fallen angels, ancient codes, apocalyptic prophesizer, merely Enoch's pages rewritten in digital light. The myth adapts, mutates, survives. Conspiracy culture, too, has inherited the flame. The Watchers have become synonymous with extraterrestrials, secret societies, and hidden elites. The Book of Enoch, rediscovered in fragments, is now invoked by both theologians and ufologists as proof of ancient contact with those who came from the sky. In online forums and fringe documentaries, the Nephilim are reimagined as hybrid bloodlines that walk among us still. Whether superstition or revelation, the fascination remains. Enoch's cosmology refuses to die. Psychologically, this endurance is no mystery. The tale of the Watchers mirrors the deepest pattern of human consciousness, the forbidden hunger to know. Every age dresses that hunger in new symbols, angels, aliens, algorithms. But beneath them all lies the same defiance that Enoch recorded in his lost pages, the belief that knowledge is divine, even when declared heretical. That is why his myth endures when others fade. It speaks not to the gods above us, but to the gods within. Even contemporary art continues to echo these themes. Musicians, writers, and filmmakers draw unconsciously from the Enochian palette imagery of wings, stars, and forbidden ascent. Modern icons like Neon Genesis Evangelion reinterpret the fall of the Watchers as psychological collapse. Others, like The Matrix, turn Enoch's revelation inward, the awakening from illusion. The vocabulary has changed, but the myth remains intact. Light imprisoned in flesh, longing to return home. Perhaps that is the secret of Enoch's immortality. Myths survive not because they are true, but because they are felt. Each generation rediscovers in them a reflection of its own forbidden questions. In the Middle Ages, the Watchers were heresy. In the Renaissance, they were enlightenment. Today, they are evolution, consciousness, transcendence. The story bends, but it never breaks. And so, the banned pages of Enoch, once burned, buried, condemned, continued to whisper through every medium that dares to explore the space between heaven and earth. From the cathedrals of Europe to the servers of the internet, his voice endures, reshaping itself to fit each era's imagination. Because myths, like light, cannot be destroyed. They only change form. The Book of Enoch was meant to be forgotten, but in the collective dream of humanity, it never was. Its angels still fall in poetry. Its Watchers still haunt the screens of modern prophecy, and its question still burns unanswered. If heaven could fall once, what is it that keeps it standing now? For nearly a millennium, the Book of Enoch existed only as a rumor, a ghost of scripture whispered about in theological margins. The church declared it lost, perhaps destroyed, a casualty of heresy's slow burn. Yet in the quiet persistence of ancient libraries and the deserts of Ethiopia, the banned text endured. Its survival was improbable, its return inevitable, because the truths buried in silence do not decay, they wait. The rediscovery began in the shadows of empire. In the late 18th century, a Scottish explorer named James Bruce returned from Abyssinia, carrying 3 dusty manuscripts. He claimed to have found them in the highlands near Gondor, among the sacred texts of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, a tradition that had never severed Enoch from its canon. These were not fragments or quotations. They were complete books written in Ge'ez, the ancient Ethiopian tongue. When Bruce presented them to European scholars, he might as well have delivered a live grenade into the heart of theology. The Book of Enoch, long declared apocryphal, was suddenly very real. Early translations began cautiously. The first English edition appeared in 1821, compiled by the linguist Richard Lawrence, later Archbishop of Cashel. His version caused quiet scandal, not through blasphemy, but through proximity. The Enochian narrative aligned too closely with passages in Genesis, Jude, and Revelation, suggesting that canonical scripture had borrowed from the very book it condemned. For some theologians, this was evidence of authenticity. For others, it was contamination. Lawrence's translation was met with polite dismissal, then deliberate neglect. Libraries accepted it, seminaries ignored it, but in academic silence, curiosity festered. By the late 19th century, the book resurfaced again in Europe's intellectual circles. Orientalists and biblical scholars debated its origins. Was it truly pre-Christian, or a later fabrication dressed in ancient clothes? The discovery of the Book of Jubilees and the assumption of Moses further complicated the picture, each echoing Enochian themes. Then, in the mid-20th century, the desert itself spoke. In 1947, Bedouin shepherds stumbled upon the Dead Sea, scrolls in the caves of Qumran, and among them were fragments unmistakably written in Aramaic, These scraps confirmed what many had doubted. The Book of Enoch was ancient, older than Christianity, older than the New Testament it had influenced. The text's exile was not due to fraud, but to fear. The question returned like a haunting refrain. What was so dangerous about Enoch's visions that both rabbis and bishops sought to erase them? Scholars rushed to retranslate and reclassify, but controversy followed like shadow. The fragments found at Qumran did not match Lawrence's earlier Ge'ez version perfectly. Some passages were missing, others rewritten, and certain key sections, those describing the Watcher's forbidden teachings, the heavenly tablets of knowledge, and the prophecy of judgment upon the kings of the earth, appeared suspiciously inconsistent between copies. Were these discrepancies the result of time and translation, or something more deliberate? Throughout the 20th century, academic circles treated Enoch with reverent caution. The scholar R.H. Charles produced what became the definitive English edition in 1912, combining multiple sources into a single coherent text. Yet even Charles admitted that portions had been lost or intentionally omitted. He referenced older catalogues that listed missing parables and an account of the celestial order texts no longer extant in any surviving copy. Other translators noted linguistic irregularities, abrupt transitions, and sudden gaps in cosmological sections, as if pages had been excised with surgical precision. Then came the whispers. Researchers claimed that early manuscripts contained marginal notes, strange symbols, or partial erasures. In 1956, fragments of one Enoch recovered from K4 at Qumran included cryptic sequences of letters that some claimed resembled angelic or Proto-Enochian alphabets, the same kind John Dee had reported centuries earlier. Mainstream academia dismissed the connection as coincidence, but the echo was too loud to ignore. By the 1970s, new translations had expanded public access to Enoch's writings, and yet rumors persisted of sections left unpublished. Certain scroll fragments, reportedly too damaged or insignificant, remained locked within institutional archives. Independent researchers alleged that fragments containing politically sensitive content, passages referencing divine punishment upon corrupt rulers or cosmic forces masquerading as kings, were withheld. The official explanation cited preservation and authenticity concerns. Unofficially, some suspected suppression, not by priests this time, but by scholars unwilling to disturb the fragile balance between faith, history, and power. Indeed, the academic gatekeeping of sacred texts has its own theology, controlled through classification. Knowledge, once the Church's monopoly, had merely changed hands. Now it was institutions, not inquisitors, deciding which revelations were credible. The same mechanisms of censorship, peer review, restricted archives, selective publication echoed the medieval fear that certain knowledge could destabilize belief. Only now, the creed was science. Modern conspiracy theorists seized upon this vacuum. They claimed the missing chapters of Enoch contained prophecies about celestial beings descending in fire. What modern ufologists reinterpreted as ancient extraterrestrial contact. Others suggested that Enoch's descriptions of luminous machines, wheels within wheels, and gates of heaven hinted at advanced technology misunderstood by ancient minds. Still others pointed to geopolitical unease. Could the warnings against kings of the earth have been excised because they resembled modern power structures too closely? Of course, historians reject these claims as sensationalism. Yet behind every wild theory lies a kernel of truth. Enoch's book has always inspired fear among those who claim authority over knowledge. Whether the threat is theological or ideological, its power remains the same. Even today, controversies persist. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church guards older versions of 1 Enoch, some untranslated into modern languages. Requests by Western scholars for full digital access have often been denied or delayed, citing spiritual protection and respect for sacred text. And while several new translations have surfaced, discrepancies between editions continue. Certain angelic hierarchies altered, phrases softened, cosmological passages it is as if the text resists uniformity, as if every attempt to contain it only fractures it further. Perhaps that is its true nature. The Book of Enoch has always existed in tension between revelation and repression, between discovery and denial. Each rediscovery seems to summon new forms of suppression, as though the universe itself conspires to keep its secrets veiled, not because the knowledge is evil, but because humanity is not yet ready to bear it. In the end, The story of the Book of Enoch's modern rediscovery mirrors its ancient myth. Knowledge descends from heaven, humanity trembles, and the light is hidden once more. Scholars call it preservation, mystics call it protection, but to those who still search the margins for missing pages, it is simply the same story repeating a divine manuscript forever rediscovered, forever redacted, forever waiting to be read in full. Every myth hides a mirror, and the Book of Enoch is no exception. Behind its visions of fallen angels and divine judgment lies something far older and more intimate: the architecture of the human mind itself. When we strip away the theology and look through a psychological lens, the banned pages no longer describe celestial rebellion alone, but the story of consciousness daring to awaken. Carl Jung called such stories mythic projections of the psyche, reflections of the inner world cast onto the heavens. In that light, the Watchers are not distant beings but fragments of ourselves, the impulses, curiosities, and desires exiled from the conscious mind. They are the architects of forbidden knowledge, those parts of humanity that reach beyond accepted boundaries, that long to understand creation even at the cost of innocence. Their fall, then, is not simply sin. It is the moment self-awareness ruptures the stillness of paradise. To study Enoch through this lens is to see the myth as an allegory for individuation, the process Jung described as the integration of the shadow. In Enoch's story, the Watchers descend from heaven to mingle with humanity, bringing knowledge of weapons, enchantments, and beauty. These gifts are double-edged, tools of civilization and instruments of corruption. Likewise, the contents of the unconscious, creativity, sexuality, power can illuminate or destroy, depending on how they are integrated. The Church feared these pages because they blurred moral lines. The psyche fears them for the same reason. The repression of the Book of Enoch mirrors the repression within the human soul. Just as the Church buried its dangerous texts, consciousness buries its dangerous thoughts. We exile our watchers, curiosity, rebellion, ambition, into the unconscious, pretending they never existed. But what is buried does not vanish. It transforms, festers, and eventually rises again, demanding acknowledgement. In this way, every act of suppression is the beginning of a return. Humanity, like the mythic angels, cannot resist the call of knowledge forever. Philosophically, the story becomes a meditation on the cost of enlightenment. Enoch, the mortal who walked with God and was not, for God took him, represents the human striving for transcendence, the desire to unite with the divine mind. Yet his journey is not a simple ascent. It begins in the shadow. He witnesses the fall of angels, the corruption of creation, and the judgment of heaven before he is lifted up. This descent into chaos is essential. In psychological terms, one must confront the unconscious, the dark and chaotic depths, before achieving higher consciousness. Light is born not in denial of darkness, but through it. This inversion, salvation through descent, is what makes the banned pages so radical. They suggest that understanding divinity requires embracing what is fallen, that the sacred cannot be known without touching the profane. For a hierarchical religion, this is intolerable. It collapses the wall between heaven and earth, between God and man, between good and evil. But for psychology, it is revelation. Wholeness is found not in purity, but in integration. The myth of the Watchers, seen through an existential lens, reveals the eternal tension between obedience and freedom. To obey the divine order is to remain innocent but unawakened. To defy it is to suffer exile but gain selfhood. The angel's rebellion mirrors the human condition, our refusal to remain within boundaries set for us by nature, gods, or destiny. We reach, we fall, we suffer, and in that suffering, we become aware. The punishment of the Watchers is the price of autonomy. Existential philosophers, like Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, would recognize this paradox. To exist is to stand apart from the divine order, to feel the loneliness of choice, the terror of freedom. In that sense, the banned pages are not about cosmic tragedy, but about becoming human. They tell the story of consciousness awakening from divine dependency. The forbidden knowledge of the angel's art, metallurgy, astronomy, desire is the same knowledge that defines civilization. The myth is not a warning against progress. It is an acknowledgement of its cost. When read this way, Enoch's ascent becomes the blueprint for psychological transformation. He begins as a man bound by mortality and ends as a bridge between worlds. His journey mirrors the process of awakening, a symbolic death and rebirth. He descends into visions of judgment, confronts cosmic horror, and emerges illuminated. This is the alchemy of the soul, transmuting fear into understanding, ignorance into wisdom. The banned aspect of Enoch's book reflects not divine secrecy, but human resistance to that process. We fear transformation because it demands that we face our inner watchers, the parts of us that question, defy, and desire. The Church called the Book of Enoch heresy because it depicted heaven as vulnerable. Psychology calls it truth because it shows that even perfection contains conflict. The story insists that duality, light and darkness, creation and destruction, is not a flaw in the cosmos, but its heartbeat. To suppress that truth is to live in denial, both spiritual and psychological, and so, the myth endures as both scripture and mirror. The watchers still fall within us when we reach too far, when our inventions outpace our wisdom, when our curiosity blurs into obsession. The flood that follows, symbolic or real, is the psyche's attempt to cleanse what it cannot yet integrate. But each fall brings a new beginning. Like Enoch, we rise again, carrying the memory of the abyss within us. In this sense, the banned pages are not truly lost. They are hidden in plain sight, within dreams, art, and the restless hunger of human thought. Every act of creation, from painting to philosophy, is a reenactment of that ancient rebellion, the spark of divine curiosity refusing to be contained. The Book of Enoch, then, is not merely scripture, it is a psychological map. Its forbidden wisdom reminds us that illumination does not come from escaping the shadow, but from walking with it. Just as Enoch walked with God, we must walk with our own darkness. To read the banned pages is to confront the secret that all myths conceal, that the divine was never outside us, and the forbidden light we seek has always burned within. The Book of Enoch ends not with a revelation, but with an absence, a silence where knowledge should be. The banned pages may never surface, yet their absence has become the most eloquent testimony of all. What the world tried to erase refuses to die, not because of parchment or ink, but because the questions it raised were never answered. Perhaps that is why their silence haunts us still. For centuries, we were told that the book was forbidden to protect us from blasphemy, from hubris, from truths too vast for mortal minds. But what if the truth was simpler and far more dangerous? What if what was really censored was not a manuscript, but a mirror, the reflection of our own divine potential? Enoch's story was never just about angels or judgment. It was about awakening, about the terrifying possibility that the boundary between heaven and earth was never real at all. And so the silence remains, heavy and deliberate, stretching across centuries like a warning and a promise, where the page is banned to shield us from the gods, or to keep us from realizing we were never beneath them.